Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we're talking with Tom Perrott, crop input specialist with Agrii, and Scott Garnett, R&D agronomist for ICL Fertilizers at Bowlby. How can crop nutrition be even more effective with unpredictable weather patterns? Can polysulphate bring real agronomic benefits for cereals and oilseed rape that can meet our environmental obligations and at the same time bring proven economic returns? So perhaps, Scott, we can start with yourself. What are we noticing, what are we seeing in the crops that are in the ground right now from a nutritional point of view? What's the need, what's the concern?
I think one of the main concerns we're seeing right out in the industry at the moment is the actual stress crops are under. We've had a hell of a lot of water that's fallen from the sky, obviously, and all the nutrients that can move through the profile have to move through the profile are away from the root system now. So out in the fields where I'm seeing sulfur deficiencies as well as a lot of other deficiencies out there. And crops really struggling. They really need a hand and picking up and hopefully giving us a yield later on in the season.
Tom, what's the impact of that in terms of looking forward to yields?
Well, I think there's probably enough farmers have been to enough meetings now to remember what the old Liebig's barrel looks like. All those nutrients have to be in balance if we want our crop to perform. As soon as one of those little bars of the sides of the barrels dips too low, we can't achieve our optimum yield. So, the nice thing about using something like polysulphate at an early start, in any year, is the fact that it's not just providing your sulfur, and it's not just about for 20 days. There's a bit more to it than that.
Yeah, so maybe taking us back to basics, but Scott, can you explain what is polysulphate? And I know that you mine that up at Bowlby, but can you tell us a little bit about it?
So basically, we're mining from it's called a Zechstein C. It's about 250 million years ago, and as the evaporation was happening, the deposits were actually left below, there at different levels. And polyhalite was actually it's about 1,250 to 1,500 meters below sea level. Was one of the deposits there. It's actually a single crystal that contains two water molecules, and it contains potassium, magnesium, calcium, and sulfur. It's not a mix of potassium sulfate, magnesium sulfate, and calcium sulfate. So it's a single crystal on its own. And because you're dealing with a rock, it releases nutrients over a longer period of time. Research that we did at Nottingham University with a PhD student, we found that the sulfur in polysulphate took about 50 days to completely leach through the profile, where we compared other products like ammonium sulfate, which leached all of its sulfur in 6 days. But going back to what Tom was just saying then regarding the polysulphate and establishment of crops, we always look at polysulphate as a sulfur product, and we talk about the importance of sulfur. And we know, as agronomically and science-based, that sulfur is critical for absorbing nitrogen into the plant, and it plays lots of other processes within the plant, from protein production, dry matter production, oil production in canola crops, and nitrogen production in legumes. But also, you've got to remember that there's, like Tom said, it's got four nutrients. You've got potassium, you've got magnesium, and calcium. And magnesium and calcium are critical for root establishment and root development. And we started off and we started talking about the stresses that we're seeing in the crops around the country. And establishment is really important in those areas. So if we can actually have a greater root mass underground, we have more opportunity to capture in nutrients that we are applying to the field. And I think that's a real big area that polysulphate ticks those boxes.
And Scott, it also has some really positive green credentials, doesn't it? Tell us about that.
Yes, so we've just announced this week the carbon footprints for polysulphate. We were sitting at 0.03. Now we're actually 90% lower. Now we've actually just come down to 0.0029. The reason we've done that is in 2023 we moved to completely renewable energy at the Bulby mine. So all the electricity on site now is solar and wind powered. So it's made a huge difference to our carbon footprint. We already had the lowest carbon footprint of a fertilizer on the marketplace, but now we've actually got it's a hell of a lot. It's probably as close to zero as I think we can get any fertilizer.
Okay, well, that's certainly good news and a great credential to have, isn't it? Tom, in terms of using it in trials, I know you've had this product in Agrii trials. For winter cereals, what sort of benefits have you seen?
Well, I think they're sort of relatively well known within the industry now. So I think it's just a case of actually understanding where it's best to fine tune the application. So, traditionally a lot of people might have said, I apply it in spring. It's one of the first products I apply. But actually we've seen, substantial benefits for actually using this product over autumn as well. We've seen a good yield increase across winter cereals in trials, somewhere in the region of sort of 350 kilos a hectare. Well, that's 350 kilos a hectare worth having. But I think the most important thing here, and it goes back to Scott's remarks about rooting, we need to set up these crops so that come spring, they're in a much stronger position to be able to withstand whatever Mrs. Mother Nature decides to throw at us, because we don't know what's coming. And actually, if we start to use polysulphate as part of what we do, we know that we're going to help the roots. We know that we're going to give the crops a balanced meal. So we know it performs well. We know it performs in damp conditions. We know it'll perform in dry conditions. We know it's very spreadable, and we know it doesn't leach away. So it's kind of ticking a lot of boxes.
And Tom, your comment there when you said, well, we don't know what Mother Nature is going to throw at us, is so relevant today, isn't it? And particularly if we look back over the last couple of seasons in terms of that variable weather patterns. So this product has a really valid place, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that is noteworthy at this point of the conversation is that it's a little bit of a myth that if you put, you've got to put polysulphate on as early as possible because it doesn't work. It takes ages to, break down and all that sort of business. And that's not actually factually correct. Just because you can see it on the ground doesn't mean that it's not working. As soon as you start to apply polysulphate, part of its makeup is a degree of sodium, and that sodium will help to absorb any moisture it can get its hands on, and it will start to slowly let that sulfur out. So it's quite a surprising material to actually use and understand once you get into the nooks and crannies of it all.
So, Tom, you've seen some good responses in the trials at Agrii. Scott, what other work have you done at ICL?
What haven't we done? It's very, very simply. So my whole life is looking at either the Polysulphate, the Fertilizer Plus range, or the ICL products into research programs. We started a project quite a few years ago looking at applying sulfur in the autumn, which goes against what everybody else, the whole industry, was looking at, because why is there a need for sulfur in the autumn? But if we look at our soils are the mineralization in our soils in the autumn is the highest it's going to be, but there's no crop there. So we've got a lot of nitrogen that's being produced and available within the soil profile. And to actually get that nitrogen into the plants, we need a small amount of potassium, a small amount of phosphate, and a small amount of sulfur. And we know from looking at soil records right around the country that I think it's like 97% of UK soils now are deficient or low in sulfur. So by raising the sulfur over that winter period, we found that we've improved nitrogen uptake by 36%, or about 10 kilos of nitrogen over the winter period. And we've done this year after year after year on numerous different sites, from organic soils to sands and clays, and we've worked with Agrii and others right around the country, and it's worked very, very well. We've actually seen that response. Go back to what Tom said earlier on, is that regarding the product, because it is what we call a slow release nutrients, or the nutrients are released, they do start releasing from day one, and Tom is very much correct about that. And it's one of those frustrations that we get, that people think we can only use it, very early in the season. We work with farmers that grow peas or potatoes or vegetables, and they put polysulphate on right at drilling or planting of crops, and the nutrients are released. And we've done this on cereal crops, where we put later applications on with poly compared to other NS products. And polysulphate we've seen exactly the same amount of sulfur within the crops as we would from other NS products.
To find out more about Agrii Fertiliser services, visit agrii.co.uk/our-services/fertiliser. And I understand that you've taken this a step further by developing a product called Drill Plus. Tell us about that.
So we had this project, and we've been running it a few years, and Agrii have kindly been involved with us, and they found the same kind of results as us with the sulfur in the autumn. Tom approached us about taking one of our products, a PK plus product or phosphate plus product, which is a PK plus polysulphate incorporated in a single granule, and adding one of our technologies, which is Agricoat, which is control release nitrogen. Now, control release nitrogen is basically urea that has a little polymer coat that sits on outside of the urea coating, and it works on temperature release. So basically, as your soil temperature starts to warm up, the polymer will expand, and we get cracks in it, which are called fissures. And then we get osmosis and reverse osmosis. So water is drawn into the granule, dissolves the fertilizer, and is pumped out. And this process will go on. And as the soil temperature cools down, the polymer will shrink and actually close down and virtually release no fertilizer at all. So over the winter period, it will just sit there dormant until we come back into the spring, and then it'll actually kick into a point as well at that point there as well.
And Tom, share a little bit with us in terms of how this works and the benefit when using it in oilseed rape.
The way that Scott describes it, if you think about that happening underground, that relates to what's happening above ground, doesn't it? If it gets warm, the plants start to grow. If they're starting to grow, they're looking for nutrition. That means that the nutrition is now being released from that polymer, and your phosphates and your potashes are available because you've got the balanced bit of nutrition where you need it. So this particular product, one of the key focus areas is using it in placement drills, or sometimes referred to as combi drills. They get all sorts of names, but basically what we're on about is placing nutrition down into the root, the sort of seeding zone where you're putting the seed. Now, some people do it down the same coulter, some people have different lines of coulters for their fertilizer, but it's that concept of putting the nutrition around the seed to provide the early nutrition to get it going. And the ultimate sort of obvious starting point is oilseed rape. It's got a high demand for phosphate and nitrogen, and we had a look at it last year. We've got growers out there using it on a commercial scale, and if you want to, you can start to tweak about with the nitrogen rate loading that you're providing that crop initially, so you can pull it back a little bit if you want. Because of the efficiency of the way you're delivering that nutrition. But ultimately, we found that a lot of our agronomists said, well, actually, I want to deliver the 30 kilos a hectare of nitrogen. And as a result, I would probably say 5 out of the 6 fields that we were looking at and little demo trials that we were looking at, that actually provided an increase in flowering percentage. Now you think, okay, so what? Big deal. You got more flowers, your field looks more pretty. Kind of work it backwards. If you've got more flowers, you've probably got more plants, or if you haven't got more plants, you've got stronger plants. So what's all the reason behind that? Well, the only difference for us where we had other products was the fact that we were using this Drill Plus balanced product with the polymer coating, and it was providing nutrition for a longer period of time to that crop. So it could get out the blocks, brilliant. Most nutrition placed at the time of drilling will do that. The difference is that the Drill Plus keeps providing the nutrition and keeps that momentum of crop development going.
And Tom, in terms of having that reality check, why should a grower or farmer consider using this source of nutrition?
Ultimately, we want to invest in nutrition that is going to be there when we need it. The one massive advantage to Drill Plus is it can rain and rain and rain and rain, and that nutrition won't leach away. That nitrogen, that main rocket fuel that you need to provide for that crop, will still be there. And the reason being goes back to what Scott was saying. When it rains, what happens to the soil temperature? The soil temperature cools down. If it cools down, that polymer is shrinking back up again and holding that nutrition in place until it warms up again and that crop starts to move away. If you do that with an untreated urea, or if you were to do that with an ammonium nitrate product, and it rains and it rains and it rains, then unfortunately those nutrients are going to start moving around, and that crop might not get it. So ultimately, for me, Drill Plus is a really nice way of protecting your investment.
And to bring this podcast to a close, as we always do, we ask for some top tips from our contributors. Scott, let's ask you first. What would be your top tips to those listening today?
Talking as a soil scientist, I'm very much about knowing what's going on in my soil, understanding, not just what pK, Mg, and pH, but understanding all those nutrients that are available in my soil, to improve nutrient use efficiency. And if I know what's there and what's not there, then I can actually, as an agronomist, we can all make better decisions. I recommend farmers to look at this autumn work of actually putting Polysulphate or Drill Plus on in the autumn. We've seen some significant improvements in nitrogen, and I would like to challenge the industry in the future is that if I can capture another 10 kilos of nitrogen over the winter period, can I take that out my spring application? That's where I would like this kind of work to eventually go. We've got a few years worth of data to prove that, but that's where we would like to go as ICL, I think.
And Tom, let's leave the last words to you, but with regards to Polysulphate, how can this really help make a difference on farm, given the challenges of the weather that we seem to face so regularly?
2 words: risk management. We're just in the throes of it now. It's a timely podcast where we're looking at new season fertilizer levels, and we can't second guess what's going to happen at a sort of geopolitical level. Anyone that can second guess what the commodity market's going to do is probably sat on a private island somewhere. So how can a farmer in Dorset or a farmer in Scotland start to understand how they can manage their risk? And that risk comes from both their farm business as cash flow and a commercial level, and also what they're doing agronomically. So if you go and buy your building blocks, your nitrogens, whatever it might be, actually using Polysulphate not only as a useful agronomic tool with benefits, it also has a benefit to your business in terms of managing your exposure to the marketplace. So you can buy it in autumn, you can buy it now, you can buy it next spring. So it just spreads your cash flow around and it spreads the risk. The other product that we've spoken about is Drill Plus, and we'd class that as a starter fertilizer. And actually you say, well, okay, how do I go about buying that and why should I do it? Well, exactly the same thing applies. Businesses now don't need to rush into new season unless it's something they want to do, unless they feel it's the right thing to do based on markets. But part of that conversation needs to be understanding how they can manage risk throughout that year. And actually, if you can buy different products at different timings throughout that year, that is what's going to help you, I believe, to just manage that exposure to risk. And, we've got oilseed rape going in the ground in the near future. So there's another nibble at the market. So it constantly builds on itself.
Thank you, Tom and Scott, for sharing your technical knowledge when it comes to the benefits of using Polysulphate. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you would like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.